I walked into Christmas dinner with my foot in a cast and a recorder in my pocket. Everyone looked at me with alarm when I told them my daughter-in-law had pushed me on purpose. My son just laughed in my face and said I deserved the lesson. What they didn't know was that I had spent 2 months preparing my revenge, and that night, every single one of them was going to get exactly what they had coming. But before I go on, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and type in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 68 years old, and I learned the hard way that trust is something you earn, not something you give away for free just because someone came from your womb. It all started 2 years ago when my husband Richard passed away from a sudden heart attack. We'd had 40 years of marriage, 4 decades building a life together and a bakery business that grew into a small chain with 5 locations across Chicago. Richard was the love of my life, my partner in everything. When he was gone, I felt like half of me had been ripped away. My only son, Daniel, showed up at the wake with his wife, Chloe, and hugged me too tightly, for too long. At the time, I thought it was comfort. Today, I know it was calculation. They were living in a rented apartment in a neighborhood far from me, and they'd visit maybe once a month. But after the funeral, they started showing up every week. Daniel insisted that I couldn't stay alone in the big house in Lincoln Park. He said he was worried about my mental health, my safety. Chloe agreed with everything, always with that sweet smile I hadn't yet learned to read as fake. I resisted at first, but the loneliness was heavy. The house that was once filled with life with Richard now just echoed with emptiness. So I gave in, and just like that, 4 months after becoming a widow, Daniel and Chloe moved into my home. They brought their things over little by little, taking over the guest room, then using the study as an office. Soon, her car was in the garage, and eventually their belongings were scattered in every corner of the house, as if it had always been theirs. In the beginning, I confess, it was a relief. Having someone in the house, hearing voices, feeling movement. Daniel would cook for me on the weekends. Chloe would go with me to the market. It felt like I had regained a piece of the family I lost when Richard died. I was a fool. The inheritance Richard left was substantial. Besides the house, which was worth over $3 million, there were the 5 bakeries, all running well and generating steady monthly profits, and a robust savings account he had built over the years. In total, the estate was worth around $5 million. Daniel was my only heir, but as long as I was alive, it was all mine. The first request for money came 6 months after they moved in. Daniel approached me one Sunday afternoon while I was watering the plants in the garden. He had that expression I knew from his childhood, when he wanted something but pretended to be embarrassed to ask. He told me the company where he worked was going through a restructuring, and he might get laid off. He needed $60,000 to invest in a specialization course that would guarantee him a better position. As a mother, how could I say no? I transferred the money the next day. 3 weeks later, it was Chloe who appeared in my bedroom, looking distressed, saying her mother was having health problems and needed $40,000 for a private surgery. I paid without questioning. After all, we were family now. The requests started to multiply. In September, another $50,000 for a can't-miss startup opportunity Daniel had found. I saw no sign of any return. Every time I brought it up, Daniel would deflect. He'd promise we'd sort it out soon, or he'd simply change the subject. I started to notice a pattern. They always asked when I was alone, always with stories designed to generate guilt or a sense of urgency. It was one Sunday morning that everything changed. I woke up early, as I always do, and went downstairs to make coffee. The house was still quiet. I put the water on to boil, and that's when I heard voices coming from their room. The hallway amplified the sound in a strange way, and I managed to hear every word with disturbing clarity. Chloe's voice came first, far too casual for what she was saying. She asked when I was going to die. Just like that, as if she were asking what time it was. I felt my body go cold. Daniel let out a nervous laugh and told her not to talk like that. But Chloe continued, relentless. She said I was 68 and could easily live another 20 or 30 years. They couldn't wait that long, she complained. They needed to find a way to speed things up, or at least ensure that when I did die, everything would pass directly to them without any complications. My hand trembled so much I almost dropped the mug I was holding. I stood there, frozen next to the stove, while my son and my daughter-in-law discussed my death as if it were a logistical problem to be solved. Daniel mumbled something about me being his mother, but with no real conviction. Chloe shot back without hesitation. She asked how much money they had already gotten out of me. Daniel replied it was about $250,000, maybe a little more. And Chloe said they could probably get another 100, maybe $150,000 before I got suspicious. After that, she started talking about the will, about power of attorney, about the possibility of getting me to sign papers that would guarantee their control over my finances before I became senile. She used that word, senile, as if it were inevitable, as if it were just a matter of time. I went back up the stairs to my room on shaky legs. I locked the door for the first time since they had moved in. I sat on the bed I had shared with Richard for so many years and cried in silence. I didn't cry from physical pain, but from the pain of realizing that my only son saw me as a financial obstacle, that the woman he chose to marry was even worse, cold and calculating to the point of planning my demise with the casualness of someone planning a vacation. That Sunday morning was the day the old Eleanor Vance died. The naive woman who believed in family above all else, who trusted her son blindly, who saw kindness where there was only greed. She died right there, in that empty bed, and in her place, another Eleanor was born, one who knew how to defend herself, one who wouldn't let anyone treat her like a fool ever again. And that new Eleanor was about to show Daniel and Chloe that they had picked the wrong victim. I spent the next few days observing. I didn't confront them. I didn't let on that I knew a thing. I continued to be the same Eleanor in front of them, the loving mother, the attentive mother-in-law, the lonely widow who depended on their company. But inside, I was putting together a puzzle. I started paying attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way Chloe always appeared in the living room when the mailman brought bank statements. How Daniel would look away whenever I mentioned the bakeries, the whispers that would abruptly stop when I walked into a room. It all started to make a sinister, painful kind of sense. I decided I needed to understand the full extent of the problem. I scheduled a meeting with Robert Miller, the accountant who had managed the bakery's finances since Richard's time. I made up some excuse about a year-end review and went to his downtown office alone. Robert was a serious man in his 60s who had always handled our business with discretion and efficiency. When I asked him to review all the financial movements of the last year, both personal and for the businesses, he frowned but didn't question it. What I discovered over the next 3 hours made me want to throw up. On top of the $290,000 I had consciously loaned them, there were regular withdrawals from the bakery's account that I had not authorized. Small amounts, $2,000 here, $3,000 there, always on Thursdays when I had my pottery class and Daniel was left in charge of signing some company documents. Robert pointed at the computer screen with a grave expression. He explained that, in total, over the last 10 months, $72,000 had been siphoned from the business accounts, always with my digital signature, which Daniel had access to as a proxy I had naively appointed to help me after Richard's death. I felt my blood boil. It wasn't just the loaned money that might never come back. It was pure, unadulterated theft, a systematic draining of amounts they thought I wouldn't notice because I trusted them to help manage the businesses. I asked Robert to do 2 things immediately. Cancel any and all power of attorney Daniel had over my accounts and businesses, and prepare a detailed report of all suspicious transactions. He suggested I consider filing a police report, but I told him to wait. I didn't know exactly how I was going to handle it yet, but I wanted all the information first. On my way home, I stopped at a coffee shop and just sat there for over an hour, nursing a tea that went cold before I drank it. My head was spinning with plans, with rage. with sadness. $362,000. That was the total Daniel and Chloe had stolen from me, between unpaid loans and embezzlement from the companies. But the money, I realized, wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the betrayal. The worst part was looking at the son I raised, the son I held, the son I taught to walk, and knowing that he saw me as an income source, that he was waiting for my death, that he was laughing at me behind my back while pretending to care. When I got home that afternoon, they were in the living room watching TV. Chloe greeted me with that same fake smile and asked if I wanted a special dinner. Daniel commented that I looked tired, feigning the concern of a devoted son. I told them I was fine, just a bit of a headache, and went up to my room. But before I went up, I turned and watched them both. Really watched, maybe for the first time since they moved in. I saw the way Chloe was curled up on the sofa as if she owned the house. How Daniel had his feet propped up on the coffee table that Richard had bought on a trip we took to the countryside. How they occupied the space that was mine, that I had built, as if it were already theirs by right. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to kick them out or confront them directly. That would be too easy, too quick. They had spent months manipulating me, stealing from me, planning my end. They deserved something more elaborate. They deserved a taste of their own medicine. I started my investigation the next day. While Daniel was at work and Chloe was out meeting friends, I went through their room. I know it was an invasion of privacy, but at that point, I no longer cared about such moral niceties. I found some interesting things, a folder with copies of my old will where I left everything to Daniel, notes on the estimated value of the house and the bakeries, screenshots of conversations in a WhatsApp group called Plan E, where Chloe discussed with friends the best ways to get power of attorney from elderly people. One of her friends had even recommended a lawyer who specialized in it. But what shocked me most was a notebook Chloe kept hidden in her lingerie drawer. It was a journal where she wrote down strategies to manipulate me. It had things written like, "Eleanor gets more emotional and generous after talking about Richard. Use that," or "always ask for money when I'm alone with her. Daniel is too weak and gets in the way." I read it all with a mixture of horror and fury. Every page was proof of how Chloe had studied my behavior, my weak spots, to better exploit me. She even noted the times I went out and the friends I saw, as if she were conducting surveillance. I took pictures of everything with my phone, every page of the notebook, every document in the folder, every screenshot. I saved it all in a hidden folder on my computer and a copy in the cloud. If they wanted to play dirty, they were about to find out I knew how, too. In the days that followed, I maintained my normal routine, but with the eyes of a hawk. I noticed Chloe rifling through my mail when she thought I wasn't looking. I caught Daniel making hushed phone calls on the balcony. I saw them exchange meaningful glances whenever I mentioned anything about my health. One night during dinner, Chloe casually mentioned that a friend of hers had taken her mother to a very good geriatrician, specializing in memory loss. She said it was important to get preventative checkups at my age. Daniel agreed far too quickly, suggesting I should schedule an appointment. I pretended to consider the idea, but inside, I was laughing. They were trying to plant the seed of the idea that I was becoming senile, creating a narrative to eventually have me declared incompetent. It was exactly the kind of move I had read about in Chloe's notebook. That's when I had an idea. If they wanted to make me out to be a fool, I would play the part perfectly. I would give them exactly what they were hoping for: a confused, vulnerable, increasingly dependent old woman. And while they thought they were winning, I would be building my trap. I started small. I pretended to forget little things. I'd ask the same question twice. I'd leave a pot on the stove a little longer than usual. Nothing too obvious. Just enough to feed their narrative. Chloe took the bait immediately. She started commenting to Daniel, just loud enough for me to hear, about my lapses. Daniel also got in on the act, suggesting that maybe I needed help managing the bakery accounts because it was becoming too complicated for me. On the outside, I would nod, feigning concern for myself. On the inside, I was documenting everything. I recorded conversations, noted dates and times, and saved evidence. Every move they made was being logged. Every word was being archived. I also hired a private investigator, discreetly. I wanted to know exactly what Daniel and Chloe were doing when they weren't at home, who they were talking to, where they were going. The investigator, a former police officer named Marcus, was efficient and discreet. 2 weeks later, Marcus brought me a report that confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed things I hadn't even imagined. Marcus met me at a cafe far from my neighborhood, far from any chance of running into Daniel or Chloe. He brought a thick folder and an expression that mixed professionalism with pity. That alone told me the news wouldn't be good. The report started with the basics: Daniel and Chloe's routines, the places they frequented, the people they met. But it quickly became clear that there was much more going on than I had imagined. First, the apartment. They hadn't terminated their old lease as they had claimed. In fact, they had renewed it and were using the place regularly, several times a week. Marcus had photos of them coming and going, always carrying expensive shopping bags, bottles of imported wine, and boxes from fancy restaurants. Basically, they were living in my house for free, eating my food and using my facilities. But they kept the apartment as a secret hideaway where they enjoyed a luxury lifestyle with the money they stole from me. The hypocrisy took my breath away, but there was more. Marcus had discovered that Chloe wasn't working, contrary to what she had always implied. The client meetings were actually afternoons at spas, high-end beauty salons, and luxury shopping centers. She was spending my money to groom herself like a socialite, while I, the actual owner of the fortune, lived modestly. The report also revealed frequent meetings with a man named Julian Price. He was a lawyer specializing in family law and inheritance, particularly in cases of legal guardianship over the elderly. Marcus had managed to confirm through a source at the firm that Chloe had consulted Julian about the procedures to obtain legal guardianship over someone deemed incompetent. My stomach churned. They weren't just stealing my money, they were actively preparing the ground to strip me of all legal control over my own life. They wanted to turn me into a legal prisoner, unable to make decisions, while they managed my fortune freely. Marcus turned another page, and his tone became even more serious. He had discovered something about Chloe's past that Daniel probably didn't know. Before marrying my son, Chloe had been married to a 72-year-old man for just 11 months. The man had died of natural causes and had left a considerable inheritance to her. At the time, the deceased's family tried to contest the will, alleging that Chloe had manipulated the old man, but they couldn't prove anything. She walked away with nearly $500,000, clean. 2 years later, she met Daniel on a dating app, a young man, the only son of a wealthy widow. The coincidence was too disturbing to be ignored. I wasn't dealing with a common, opportunistic daughter-in-law. I was dealing with someone who had experience in manipulating the elderly to get their inheritance, someone who had almost made a profession out of it. And my son, my Daniel, was either a willing accomplice or a useful tool in her hands. Marcus showed me photos of this Julian, a man in his 40s, well-dressed, with that air of someone who knows exactly how the system works and how to exploit it. Apparently, he had a history of helping families obtain guardianship over elderly relatives, always for exorbitant fees. His firm specialized in that lucrative and morally questionable niche. I asked Marcus to continue his investigation, especially focusing on any contact between Chloe and people from her first marriage and any suspicious financial movements. He agreed and promised more information in 2 weeks. I left that cafe with the report hidden in my purse and a crystal clear clarity in my mind. Chloe wasn't just an opportunist who saw a chance and took it. She was a professional predator who had chosen my son, and through him, me, as deliberate targets. And Daniel, my own blood, had accepted that role, whether out of greed, weakness, or a combination of both. That night, I couldn't bring myself to have dinner with them. I feigned a headache and went up early, but in reality, I stayed in my room, analyzing every page of Marcus's report, connecting the dots, and understanding the full extent of the trap I had fallen into. They had a long-term plan. First, drain my accounts through loans and embezzlement. Second, create a narrative of mental decline. Third, use Julian to obtain legal guardianship. And then, with total control over my finances and person, turn me into an empty shell while they lived off my fortune until I died naturally. Or, who knows, with a little help. The memory of the conversation I overheard about when I would die and if they could speed things up took on a new, more sinister weight. With Chloe's history of an elderly husband who died conveniently early, it wasn't paranoia to consider she might be planning something similar for me. I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to counterattack. I was going to use every piece of information I had, every bit of proof Marcus could get, every mistake they made, to turn the tables on them completely. By the time I was done with them, Daniel and Chloe would understand the true meaning of messing with the wrong person. I started with the obvious, changing my will. I scheduled a meeting with my trusted lawyer, Arthur Cole, who had handled the legal affairs for the bakeries for years. I went to his office on a day when Daniel was traveling for work and Chloe was supposedly visiting her mother. Arthur received me with his usual care, offering coffee and asking about my health. When I explained that I wanted to make significant changes to my will, he picked up a pen and paper with an attentive expression. First, I removed Daniel as the universal heir. Instead, I divided my assets so that the bakeries and half of the money would go to a charitable foundation that helps disadvantaged children. The house and the other half of the money would go to my nephew Leo, my deceased brother's son, a serious and hard-working young man who had always kept in touch with me without any financial interest. Daniel would inherit only a symbolic amount of $50,000, enough that he couldn't contest the will by claiming he was forgotten, but small enough to make my dissatisfaction clear. And I left an explanatory letter, sealed, to be opened only after my death, detailing the reasons for my decision. Arthur asked a few questions, making sure I was lucid and certain of my decision. I explained superficially that there had been trust issues without going into detail. He was professional enough not to press, only ensuring that everything would be done according to the law and kept in absolute secrecy. I also took the opportunity to create a healthcare power of attorney, naming my best friend, Sonia, as the person responsible for making medical decisions for me in case I became incapacitated. Any attempt by Chloe and Daniel to have me committed or medicated against my will would now hit that legal barrier. I left the law firm feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It was only the first step, but an important one. Now, even if the worst happened to me, they wouldn't get what they wanted. All the planning, all the manipulation would be for nothing. But I didn't intend for the worst to happen. I intended to be alive and well to see their faces when they found out they had lost everything. November arrived with that biting Chicago wind. It had been almost 4 months since I had discovered the truth about Daniel and Chloe, and I had used every day of that time to build my case against them. Marcus continued to bring me information. We discovered that Chloe was meeting regularly with Julian, the lawyer, always at the secret apartment they maintained. We even managed to get photos of them entering the building together and audio recordings that proved they were preparing documentation to request my legal incapacitation. In one of those recordings, I heard Julian explaining to Chloe that they needed medical reports to prove my mental decline. He suggested they get me to a specific doctor, someone who worked with him and was willing to diagnose cognitive problems for an extra fee. It was blatant corruption, a well-oiled scheme to defraud the legal system. Chloe asked how long it would take. Julian replied that with the right documents, including witness statements about my erratic behavior, they could have the guardianship approved in 2 or 3 months. From there, they would have total control over my finances and personal decisions. The coldness with which they discussed this, as if it were any other business deal, sent a shiver down my spine. But it also gave me clarity. I wasn't facing people with an ounce of conscience or remorse. I was facing criminals, pure and simple. I decided it was time to start tightening the net, but I needed to do it strategically, without showing all my cards at once. I started with small tests. One Thursday during dinner, I casually mentioned that I was thinking of selling one of the bakeries, the one with the lowest profits, I said, to simplify my life. Daniel nearly choked on his food. Chloe became visibly tense. They spent the entire meal trying to convince me it was a terrible idea, that I was confused, that the bakeries were my legacy and I would regret it. Their concern had nothing to do with me, of course. They were terrified at the idea of me selling assets before they could get control over them. I let the topic die naturally, saying I'd think about it, but I watched them become agitated in the following days. Chloe made urgent calls, probably to Julian. Daniel started questioning me more about my finances, disguised as a precious son. A couple of weeks later, I dropped another bomb. I said I had scheduled a consultation with a lawyer to discuss updating my will. Their reaction was even more intense. They immediately asked which lawyer, why I thought it was necessary, if something was worrying me. I lied, saying it was just a routine review that Arthur had suggested. They insisted on coming with me, to support me. I politely refused, saying I needed to do it alone, that it was important for me to maintain some independence in my decisions. That night, after I pretended to go to sleep, I sat in the dark corner of the hallway and listened to their argument in the bedroom. They were in a panic. Chloe was saying they needed to speed up the guardianship process, that I was starting to do things that could compromise the plan. Daniel agreed, but seemed hesitant, worried if they could get enough proof. Chloe then suggested something that chilled me to the bone. She said maybe they needed to create some evidence, to make me seem more confused than I really was. Daniel asked how. She replied that there were ways. Medications mixed into my food could cause temporary mental confusion. Small accidents could create the impression that I was losing my physical and mental capabilities. I heard that and felt for the first time real fear. They weren't just planning to rob me. They were willing to drug me, to hurt me, to deliberately destroy my health to achieve their goals. I went back to my room with trembling legs, and for the first time in months, I cried for real. I cried for the loss of the son I thought I had. I cried for my naivety in trusting them. But mostly, I cried out of anger, a deep, cold anger that settled in my chest and wouldn't leave. The next day, I called Marcus and told him about the conversation. He became serious and said we needed to involve the police, that this had gone beyond simple financial fraud to planning an assault. But I asked him to wait. I had a better plan. If Chloe wanted to make me look confused, I would give her exactly that, but in a controlled, documented way that would ultimately turn against her. I started playing the part of the old lady losing her mind, but in an exaggerated, almost theatrical way. I'd pretend to forget where I put things, only to find them in obvious places right in front of them. I'd ask the same question twice in a row, but always about trivial matters. I'd leave lights on, doors open, empty pots on the stove. Nothing dangerous, but all very visible. And most importantly, I documented everything. I installed hidden cameras at strategic points in the house, small, discreet, recording everything in high definition and automatically saving to the cloud. Every move they made, every conversation, every conspiratorial glance was being recorded. Chloe took the bait voraciously. She started inviting her friends over, always when I was nearby doing something confused. They would witness my forgetfulness, my disorganization, and Chloe would narrate it all with that fake, concerned voice. I knew she was building her network of witnesses. What she didn't know was that my cameras were capturing the conversations after I left the room. They captured Chloe, telling her friends that I was worse than I seemed, that I could no longer take care of myself, that they would soon need to take legal action. They captured the laughter when they thought I couldn't hear, the comments about how great it would be when they had access to all the money. Daniel also joined the game, but differently. He started bringing documents home, papers from the bakeries that needed my signature. Only now he would scrutinize every signature, comparing it to previous ones, looking for signs of tremor or lack of coordination he could use as proof of decline. So I started signing some things with a deliberately trembling hand. Other times, I'd sign perfectly. I wanted to create inconsistency, to give them hope, but never certainty. Watching them get frustrated, trying to figure out my real state, was almost satisfying. But everything changed one afternoon in December, 3 weeks before Christmas. I had gone to the supermarket to do some shopping. As I returned, with bags in my hands, I climbed the 3 steps to the front door as I had for 20 years. Only this time, I felt something push me from behind. It wasn't an accidental stumble. It was a deliberate, hard shove, with 2 hands flat on my back. I lost my balance completely. The bags flew, and I fell sideways onto the concrete steps. The pain was immediate and excruciating. I felt something snap in my right foot on impact. I screamed, more out of shock than pain, and tried to turn to see who had pushed me. It was Chloe. She was standing there at the top of the steps with an expression that wasn't of shock or concern. It was cold satisfaction. Our eyes met for a second, and in that second, I saw everything. She had done it on purpose. She had deliberately pushed me, calculating that the fall would injure me. Before I could say anything, I heard quick footsteps. Daniel appeared from inside the house. He looked at me on the ground. He looked at Chloe. And then he did something that broke the last piece of my heart that still held out hope for him. He laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh of surprise. It was a genuine, approving laugh, almost of pride. And then he said, in a voice I had never heard come from my son's mouth, something that would be seared into my memory forever. "She's just teaching you a lesson. You deserve it." I lay there, crumpled on the steps, my foot throbbing with pain, looking up at the man I gave birth to. The man I carried for 9 months, raised with all the love I had, and heard him tell me I deserved to be assaulted, that I deserved to be hurt, that this was a lesson. Chloe calmly walked down the steps, picked up the dropped grocery bags, and went inside the house as if nothing had happened. Daniel stood there a second longer, the smirk still on his face, before following his wife. They left me there. They didn't call for help. They didn't offer support. They didn't show an ounce of remorse. They just abandoned me on the front steps of my house with a broken foot, as if I were disposable trash. It was my neighbors who found me. Mrs. Gable, who lives 3 houses down, was coming back from the pharmacy and saw me. She cried out for help, called her husband, and together they helped me into their car to take me to the hospital. On the way, with the pain pulsing in my leg and silent tears streaming down my face, I made a choice. This had been their final mistake, the mistake that would turn all my pain, all my anger, all my planning into concrete action. They had crossed the line from psychological manipulation to physical violence. And that changed everything. In the emergency room, while waiting to be seen, I called Marcus. I explained what had happened. He was silent for a moment. Then he asked if I was absolutely certain it was on purpose. I said I was certain, that Chloe had pushed me deliberately, and Daniel had approved, saying it was a lesson I deserved. Marcus then said something that surprised me. He asked if there were cameras at the entrance of the house. And that's when I remembered. The external camera I had installed weeks ago, hidden in the porch light fixture, pointed directly at the stairs. If it was working, it had recorded everything. The push, the fall, their reaction, Daniel's words, everything. I asked Marcus to go to my house, make up some excuse, and discreetly check if the camera had captured the incident. He said he would go immediately. 2 hours later, sitting in a wheelchair with my right foot in a cast up to my knee, I received a text from Marcus. Just 2 words and an emoji. We got it. The camera had worked perfectly. It had recorded Chloe looking around before she pushed me, checking for witnesses. It had recorded the push itself, deliberate and forceful. It had recorded my fall and my scream, and most importantly, it had recorded Daniel laughing and saying those monstrous words. It was irrefutable proof of intentional physical assault, and I intended to use every second of that recording to completely destroy their plans. The doctors said my foot was fractured in 2 places. I would need surgery to insert pins, followed by months of physical therapy. I was admitted overnight for surgery the next morning. Daniel and Chloe showed up at the hospital a couple of hours later. Chloe brought flowers and an expression of concern that would have won an Oscar. Daniel held my hand and talked about how worried he was, how they had panicked when the neighbors told them about my fall, as if I had just tripped on my own. I let them perform. I let Chloe stroke my hair and say she would take care of me during my recovery. I let Daniel promise he wouldn't leave my side. And inside, I was planning every detail of what was to come. Because in 2 days, it would be Christmas. And this was going to be a Christmas dinner none of us would ever forget. The surgery on my foot was successful, but painful. They placed 2 titanium pins and told me I'd need to wear the cast for at least 6 weeks, followed by intense physical therapy. I was discharged on the afternoon of December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve. Chloe made a point of picking me up from the hospital, bringing a wheelchair they had rented and acting like the dedicated daughter-in-law she never was. On the way home, she chattered nonstop about how she'd prepared my room, bought special pillows to elevate my leg, how she was going to take care of every detail of my recovery. I barely nodded, letting the pain medication give me an excuse to be quiet. But I was observing everything. The way she drove a little too fast around corners, making my foot bump against the dashboard and hurt more. The glances she shot in the rearview mirror, not of concern, but of calculation. She was gauging my fragility, my dependence, seeing how far she could push me now that I was literally injured. When we got home, Daniel was waiting at the door. He helped me out of the car and into the wheelchair with careful gestures, but his eyes were empty. There was no love there, no genuine filial concern, just the performance of a role he had chosen to play. They settled me in my room, and Chloe brought me soup. I didn't eat. I said the hospital medication had taken away my appetite. The truth was, I didn't trust anything that came from her hands, not after the conversation I overheard about putting drugs in my food. The soup might have been perfectly normal, but I wasn't going to risk it. That night, alone in my room with the door locked, I called Marcus. He told me he had compiled all the camera recordings from the last 2 months. We had hours of material showing suspicious conversations, meetings with Julian, discussions of their plans, and most importantly, the crystal clear recording of the assault on the stairs. I told him about my plan for Christmas dinner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I was sure. This was going to blow up my family in a way that had no coming back. I replied that my family had already blown up the moment my son laughed at my pain and said I deserved to be hurt. What I was going to do on Christmas was just make it official. Marcus agreed to help. He said he would coordinate with the police, that we would need officers present at the right moment. He also contacted Arthur, my lawyer, and Robert, the accountant. Everyone needed to be aware of what was about to happen. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the house was strangely tense. Chloe had decorated everything excessively, as if the sheer number of ornaments could create the illusion of a happy family. Daniel had bought an expensive turkey and imported wines. They were planning a big celebration, and I knew why. They thought they had won. That with my broken foot, physically dependent on them, more fragile and vulnerable than ever, they finally had me where they wanted me. The assault hadn't just been gratuitous violence. It had been strategic to incapacitate me, make me dependent, easier to control. What they didn't know was that they had only accelerated their own destruction. On Christmas morning, Chloe came into my room, all cheerful. She said they had prepared a special lunch, that they had even invited a few people. I asked who. She listed the names. A few of her friends, the same ones who had come over to witness my supposed moments of confusion, and surprisingly, Julian, the lawyer. I felt a chill. They were going to use Christmas, with witnesses present, to create another episode of my supposed incompetence. They were probably planning some scene where I would appear confused or incapable, right in front of the lawyer who would prepare the guardianship papers. I told Chloe I felt well enough to join the lunch. She seemed far too pleased with that. She helped me get ready, picked out an outfit for me as if I were a child, and wheeled me into the living room. The table was set extravagantly. Too much food, too many decorations, too much of everything. Chloe's friends were already there, all greeting me with that fake pity people show when they think you're losing your mind. Julian arrived shortly after, a man in an expensive suit and a professional smile. Daniel made the introductions, presenting Julian as a lawyer friend who was helping with some family legal matters. Julian shook my hand with a measured firmness and told me he had heard a lot about me. I bet you have, I thought. The lunch began with the typical awkwardness of a forced celebration. Chloe served the food, Daniel opened the wine, the friends chit-chatted about trivial things, and I watched, waiting. It didn't take long for them to start. Chloe casually mentioned that I had gotten confused that morning, trying to leave my room without the wheelchair. One of the friends commented on how hard it must be for me to accept my limitations. Another agreed, saying her grandmother had gone through the same phase of denial when she started losing her faculties. Julian listened to it all with professional attention, asking subtle questions about my routine, my memory, my ability to make decisions. It was an interrogation disguised as a casual conversation, and everyone at the table knew it, except, apparently, me. That's when I decided to start my own performance. I feigned confusion about where I was. I asked if it was time for Easter lunch yet. Chloe exchanged meaningful looks with Julian. One of the friends sighed with pity. Daniel gently corrected me, saying it was Christmas, not Easter. I feigned surprise, then embarrassment. I said my foot was hurting and the medication made me dizzy. Julian discreetly jotted something down in a small notebook. I continued like this throughout the meal, moments of clarity interspersed with apparent confusion. Nothing too over the top, just enough to feed the narrative they wanted to build. And every second was being recorded by cameras they didn't know existed. After lunch, when everyone was in the living room having coffee, pretending to celebrate, my moment arrived. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 3 p.m, the time I had arranged with Marcus. I stood up from the wheelchair with difficulty, leaning on the crutch the doctors had given me. Everyone stopped talking and looked at me. Chloe quickly got up, coming toward me with that mask of concern. That's when the doorbell rang. The silence in the room was absolute. Daniel and Chloe looked at each other, confused. They weren't expecting anyone else. I offered to get it, but Chloe said she would, that I should sit down. I just smiled and said I would go myself. After all, it was my house. I walked slowly to the door, leaning on my crutch, feeling all eyes on my back. I opened the door calmly. On the other side stood 2 uniformed police officers, Marcus and Arthur Cole, my lawyer. I turned back to the living room where everyone was frozen, processing the scene. And then I said, in a voice firmer and clearer than I had used in months, "Officers, please come in. I have a report to file." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I saw the color drain from Chloe's face. Her eyes widened as the police officers stepped inside. Daniel stood frozen, his mouth agape, unable to form words. Chloe's friends looked at each other, bewildered. Julian, the lawyer, immediately adopted a defensive posture, closing his notebook and crossing his arms. The lead officer, Commander Silva, a man in his 50s with a commanding presence, entered the room and surveyed each person present. Behind him, Marcus carried a laptop, and Arthur held a thick folder of documents. I excused myself and returned to my wheelchair, not because I needed it, but because the visual drama of the moment was worth every second. A 68-year-old woman, foot in a cast, a visible victim of violence, reporting her own family on Christmas Day. It was an image that would be burned into the memory of everyone present. Commander Silva formally introduced himself and asked for Daniel and Chloe Vance. My son and daughter-in-law identified themselves with trembling voices. One of Chloe's friends nervously stood up, saying perhaps it was best if they left, but the commander kindly asked everyone to remain seated. It was then that I began to speak. My voice came out firm, unwavering, completely different from the confused woman I had been playing during lunch. I explained that for the past several months, I had been the victim of systematic financial embezzlement, totaling approximately $362,000, that my son and daughter-in-law had gained access to my accounts through a power of attorney I had granted them in trust after my husband's death, that they had used that access to steal money from both my personal accounts and the businesses I managed. Daniel tried to interrupt, saying they were family loans, misunderstandings. The commander told him to wait his turn to speak. I continued. I said that through private investigation, I had discovered they maintained a secret apartment paid for with my money, where they lived a life of luxury while living in my house for free. That Chloe had a history of marrying an elderly man who conveniently died, leaving her as his heir. That they had hired a lawyer specializing in legal incapacitation to have me declared mentally incompetent. Julian tried to protest, claiming he didn't know what I was talking about, that he was only providing legal consultation. Arthur opened his folder and produced copies of emails between Julian and Chloe, discussing the exact procedures for having me committed. The lawyer turned pale. But the worst part, I continued, my voice steady, is that after they discovered I was investigating, they began planning ways to drug me to create false evidence of mental decline. And that 3 days ago, my daughter-in-law deliberately pushed me down the stairs, breaking my foot. Chloe exploded. She screamed that I had fallen on my own, that I was delusional, that the medication was making me paranoid. Her friends chimed in, saying I was clearly unwell, that my behavior during lunch proved my confusion. That's when Marcus opened the laptop. On the large screen, he connected to the living room TV. The recording from the external camera began to play. Everyone could see in high definition Chloe looking around, checking if anyone was watching. Then, with deliberate, clear movements, she placed both hands on my back and shoved me with force. The entire room could see my fall, hear my cry of pain, and then they could see and hear Daniel coming out of the house, looking down at me and laughing. His voice came clearly from the speakers. "She's just teaching you a lesson. You deserve it." The silence that followed was absolute. One of Chloe's friends brought a hand to her mouth, horrified. Another began to cry softly. Julian discreetly moved away from Chloe, as if physical proximity could contaminate him. Chloe stared at the screen. She looked at me, at the police, processing the fact that she had been recorded. Daniel was as white as a sheet, staring at his own hands as if he didn't recognize the man who had laughed at his own mother's fall. But Marcus wasn't finished. He began to play other recordings, conversations between Daniel and Chloe about speeding up my death, discussions about putting medication in my food, the audio of the consultation with Julian about the incapacitation procedures, the visits to the secret apartment. Each video, each audio clip was a hammer blow to any defense they might try to build. There was no way to deny it, no way to justify it. It was all there, recorded, dated, and authenticated. When the videos finished, Commander Silva addressed Daniel and Chloe. He stated they were under arrest, Chloe for aggravated battery and Daniel for complicity and threat. He added that other crimes would be investigated, including embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Chloe tried to run. She literally tried to bolt for the kitchen door, but one of the officers easily intercepted her. She started screaming that I had planned it all, that I had fabricated the evidence, that I was trying to steal the inheritance that was rightfully theirs. The irony of her words was lost on no one in the room. Daniel, on the other hand, collapsed. He slumped to the floor, his back against the wall, and began to cry. They weren't tears of remorse, I realized. They were tears of self-pity from a man who had thrown everything away for greed and had lost. The police handcuffed them. Chloe continued to scream, fighting against the cuffs, spewing threats and insults. Daniel just cried silently, his face hidden in his hands. Before they were taken away, Commander Silva asked if I wanted to say anything. I looked at my son, the man I had carried, raised and loved unconditionally for 28 years, the man who had laughed when he saw me fallen, hurt, and bleeding. And I said only one thing: "You are no longer my son. Not from the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive." Daniel looked at me, his eyes red from crying, and tried to speak. He tried to say he was sorry, that he had been influenced, that he never wanted it to come to this. But I held up my hand, silencing him. There was nothing he could say that would change what he had done. There was no excuse, no justification. There was no forgiveness possible for someone who plots their own mother's death. The police took them away. Chloe was still screaming in the hallway, her voice echoing through the house until the patrol car door slammed shut. Daniel left in silence, his head bowed in defeat. Chloe's friends scurried out, muttering apologies, probably already imagining how they would explain to others that they had witnessed an arrest at Christmas lunch. Julian tried to slip out discreetly, but Arthur intercepted him, stating that the Bar Association would be notified of his involvement in the fraudulent scheme. When everyone was finally gone and the house fell silent, I found myself alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of a Christmas lunch that never became a celebration. The cold turkey on the table, the half-finished wine, the dessert plates no one had touched. Marcus stayed with me. He sat beside me and asked if I was okay. I answered honestly. I didn't know. Part of me felt immense relief. The threat had been neutralized. My safety was guaranteed. Justice would be served. But another part of me, the part that was still a mother despite everything, ached in a way no broken bone ever could. Because even knowing Daniel didn't love me, even with proof of his betrayal, it was still hard to accept that I had lost my son. Not to death, but to something much worse, to the greed that had transformed him into a cruel stranger. Arthur returned an hour later with papers for me to sign, documents formalizing the criminal complaint, authorizations to proceed with the full investigation, and confirmation that the new will was secure and protected. I signed everything with a steady hand, without hesitation. That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply, not because I was happy, but because I was safe. The monster that had been living in my own house was gone. The threat to my life was over. Tomorrow, the legal process would begin. The hearings, the testimonies, it would be long, painful, and public. But I was ready, because Eleanor Vance was no longer the naive, trusting widow she had been. She was a survivor, and survivors don't give up. The days following Christmas were a whirlwind of legal activity and media attention I hadn't expected. The story of a mother being assaulted and robbed by her own son and daughter-in-law caught the attention of local papers, then larger news portals. Reporters camped outside my house, asking for interviews, wanting details. Marcus advised me not to speak to the press until the legal process was further along. Arthur agreed, saying any public statement could be used by the defense, so I remained silent, which only fueled public curiosity. What we discovered in the following weeks, as the police deepened their investigation, went far beyond what I had imagined. Chloe hadn't just had one previous husband who died conveniently. She had two. The first, whom no one knew about because she had used a different maiden name at the time, had been a 65-year-old businessman who died of a heart attack just 6 months after their wedding. She inherited an apartment and nearly $200,000. The second husband, the one I already knew about, the 72-year-old, had left even more. In total, Chloe had inherited over $1 million from two elderly husbands who died in circumstances that, while officially natural, were statistically very convenient. The police reopened both cases for investigation. Bodies were exhumed, medical reports were reviewed, and families were interviewed, and they began to find patterns. In both cases, the men had been healthy until they met Chloe. After the marriage, they quickly developed heart problems, uncontrolled hypertension, and episodes of confusion that resulted in falls. A toxicologist was brought in to review the old reports. He noted that the symptoms were consistent with gradual poisoning by certain medications that, in small, regular doses, would cause exactly the problems Chloe's husbands had developed. They were substances difficult to detect in routine autopsies, especially when doctors already expected to find heart issues due to age. When they told me this, a chill ran down my spine because I realized just how close I had come to being the third victim. If I hadn't discovered the plan in time, if I hadn't stopped eating the food Chloe prepared, my obituary might now be in the papers, citing death by natural causes. Daniel was also being investigated more deeply. They discovered he had gambling debts he had hidden from me. Nearly $100,000 owed to loan sharks, incurred even before he met Chloe. When Chloe entered his life with inheritance money, she must have seemed like the perfect solution. And when her money ran out, I became the next target. The district attorney's office built a solid case. Charges of aggravated battery for Chloe, fraud for both, criminal conspiracy, and for Julian, the lawyer, participation in a fraudulent scheme. The sentences, if they were convicted, could reach 15 years for Chloe and 10 for Daniel. The preliminary hearing was set for February. Arthur prepared me extensively. He said I would be called to testify and that the defense would try to discredit me, painting me as a vengeful, controlling mother who invented accusations because she couldn't accept her son had grown up and formed his own family. When the day came, I was nervous, but prepared. The courtroom was packed. Part of Chloe's family, who believed in her innocence, occupied half the chairs. The other half was filled with reporters and the curious. I walked in with crutches, my foot still in a cast, serving as a visual reminder of the violence I had suffered. Daniel and Chloe were already there, seated with their lawyers. Daniel looked at me when I entered, and for the first time, I saw something resembling real shame in his eyes. Chloe, on the other hand, stared at me with pure hatred. There were no more masks, no more sweet, attentive daughter-in-law. It was just raw, naked rage. The judge, a man in his 60s with a reputation for severity, opened the session. He asked the prosecution to present their case. The assigned prosecutor, a competent woman in her 40s with experience in crimes against the elderly, presented the case meticulously. She showed the financial evidence, the embezzlement, the unpaid loans, the secret apartment. She presented the audio of the conversations about speeding up my death, about drugging me, about obtaining fraudulent guardianship. And finally, she played the video of the assault on the stairs. The entire courtroom watched in silence as the recording showed Chloe pushing me and Daniel laughing, saying it was a lesson I deserved. I saw some people in the audience shake their heads in disapproval. An older woman, who I later found out was Chloe's aunt, began to cry softly. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with difficulty. The judge offered to let me remain seated for the entire testimony, given my physical condition. I accepted gratefully. The prosecutor asked me direct questions. When did I discover the embezzlement? How did I feel when I heard my son and daughter-in-law planning my death? What happened on the stairs on December 22nd? I answered everything calmly, without dramatization, just stating the facts. I explained that I had trusted them completely, that I had given my son power of attorney after my husband's death because I thought he would help me, that I never imagined that trust would be used to systematically rob me. I told them about the morning I overheard the conversation, about the coldness with which they discussed how much longer I would live, about the fear I felt when I realized I wasn't safe in my own home, and finally, about the push, about the physical and emotional pain of being deliberately assaulted by my daughter-in-law while my son approved. By the time I finished, tears were running down my face. They weren't planned, they weren't a performance. It was real pain, real grief for the family I thought I had and discovered was an illusion. Chloe's lawyer, an aggressive man known for his intimidation tactics, began the cross-examination. He tried to paint me as controlling, asking if I didn't have difficulty accepting that Daniel was an adult with a right to his own life. If it wasn't possible that my interpretation of the conversations I heard was distorted by my emotional state after being widowed, I patiently replied that being in mourning didn't make me deaf or unable to understand plain English. That hearing someone say, "When is the old woman going to die? We can't wait 30 years," didn't leave much room for interpretation. He then suggested that maybe I had fallen on my own on the stairs, and in my confused state documented by the lunch witnesses, I had created a false narrative of assault, that the video only showed Chloe near me, not necessarily pushing me. The prosecutor immediately objected, asking for the video to be played again frame by frame, and there, for everyone to see, it was clear. Chloe's hands extended on my back, pushing with enough force to move my entire body forward. There was no ambiguity, no alternative interpretation. It was clear and deliberate assault. Daniel's lawyer tried a different approach. He suggested my son had been manipulated by Chloe, that she was the real criminal, that Daniel was essentially another victim, seduced by a calculating woman with a history of exploiting the elderly. I looked at Daniel as the lawyer said this. My son kept his eyes down, neither confirming nor denying. Part of me wanted to believe that narrative. I wanted to think my boy had been deceived, manipulated, led down the wrong path by a malevolent influence. But then I remembered the laugh, the way he had laughed when he saw me fall, bleeding with a broken foot, the way he said I deserved that lesson. That wasn't manipulation. That was cruelty that came from within him, from a dark place that had perhaps always been there, and I had never wanted to see. When the judge asked if I had anything else to declare before finishing my testimony, I asked for permission to speak directly to my son. The judge hesitated but eventually agreed. I looked at Daniel. He finally raised his eyes and met mine, and I said, in a voice that came out firmer than I expected, "Daniel, for 28 years, I loved you unconditionally. I gave you everything I could: love, education, opportunities, trust. When your father died, you were the most important person in my life, and you took all of that and turned it into a weapon against me, not out of need, not out of desperation, but out of pure greed. You stole from me. You betrayed me. You laughed at my pain. So no, you are not a victim of anyone but your own choices, and you will have to live with them for the rest of your life." Daniel began to cry. They were no longer tears of self-pity, I realized, but tears of someone who finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. Not the money, not the inheritance, but something far more precious: his own mother's love. The judge ended my participation and called other witnesses. Robert, my accountant, confirmed the financial embezzlement with detailed documentation. Marcus presented the full results of his investigation. Even neighbors were called to testify about changes in my behavior, confirming that I had always been lucid and capable, debunking the narrative of mental decline that Chloe and Daniel had tried to build. The toxicologist who reviewed the cases of Chloe's previous husbands also testified, presenting analyses that strongly suggested gradual poisoning. The defense tried to discredit his findings, but the evidence was technical, scientific, and hard to refute. The hearing lasted 3 full days. In the end, the judge determined there was sufficient cause for a full trial. He denied bail for Chloe, citing a flight risk and a danger to witnesses, especially me. For Daniel, he granted a high bail of $500,000, which he had no way of paying. Both would remain in custody until the trial. When I left the courthouse that last day, reporters surrounded me. This time, Marcus and Arthur agreed that I could speak. Not much, just a brief statement. I looked at the cameras and said, "I trusted the wrong people because they were my family. I paid dearly for that trust, but I won't let what happened to me happen to others. If anyone is going through something similar, hearing strange conversations, noticing money disappearing, feeling manipulated by their own family, Do not ignore the signs. Seek help. Because family isn't who shares your blood. Family is who respects your life. The statement was replayed on several news channels. I received hundreds of messages from people telling similar stories, thanking me for having the courage to speak out. Some called me an inspiration. I didn't feel inspiring. I felt tired, hurt, but also determined to see this through to the end. The trial was scheduled for May, 4 months later. In the meantime, my life slowly began to rebuild. The cast came off. I started physical therapy. I regained mobility. I went back to managing the bakeries personally. I reconnected with friends I had neglected. I started to live again. The house, which had been invaded by the toxic presence of Daniel and Chloe, became mine again. I redecorated the room they had used, turning it into an office. I removed everything that reminded me of them, every photo, every object. It was painful but necessary. My younger sister Claire, who lived out of state, came to spend a week with me. She hugged me tightly when she arrived and said she was sorry she hadn't noticed what was happening. I explained that I hadn't realized it myself for a long time, that manipulators are skilled at hiding their true intentions. We spent that week talking, remembering our childhood, our family, our parents who had already passed. Claire reminded me of the strong woman I had always been, before grief and loneliness made me vulnerable. She said that Eleanor was coming back, and she was right. When May finally arrived, I was ready to face Daniel and Chloe in court, ready to tell my full story, ready to see justice done. The trial would be long, perhaps weeks, but I wouldn't run. I wouldn't give up, because this wasn't just about me. It was about all the elderly people who are exploited, abused, and manipulated by those who should protect them. It was about proving that being older doesn't mean being weak, and that Eleanor Vance was not a victim. She was a survivor. The trial began on a rainy Monday in May. The courtroom was even more crowded than at the preliminary hearing. The case had gained national notoriety, becoming a cautionary tale of how families could turn dangerous when money was involved. Chloe entered the courtroom with a completely different look. Hair pulled back, no makeup, simple clothes. It was clearly a defense strategy to make her seem less threatening, more vulnerable. But her eyes, when they met mine, still burned with that icy hatred. Daniel was thinner, paler, with deep, dark circles. The months in jail had taken their toll. He didn't look at me when he entered, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. I don't know if it was shame or cowardice, maybe both. The prosecutor opened with a devastating summary of the case. She presented the complete timeline, from my husband's death, through the financial embezzlement, the recorded conversations, to the culmination in physical assault. She painted a picture of systematic predators who had chosen a vulnerable widow as their target. When it was the defense's turn, Chloe's lawyer attempted a risky strategy. He admitted she had made mistakes, but argued that it was all for the love of Daniel, that she was a devoted wife trying to help her husband solve financial problems, that the push had been an accident, a moment of frustration where she just reached out her hand and I, unbalanced by age and medication, fell. The narrative might have been convincing if it weren't for the video. The prosecutor played it again, this time with analysis from a body language expert who pointed out every detail. Chloe checking for witnesses, positioning herself strategically behind me, the deliberate movement of her arms, the force applied. There was no ambiguity. It was premeditated assault. Daniel's lawyer, on the other hand, stuck to the line that he was a victim of manipulation. He presented witnesses who talked about what Daniel was like before meeting Chloe, a hard-working young man, a good son with no criminal record. They suggested that Chloe, with her experience in manipulating the elderly, had seduced and corrupted a vulnerable young man with gambling debts. It was partially true. Daniel had debts before meeting Chloe, but that didn't explain the laugh. It didn't explain the cruel words. It didn't explain the active complicity in every stage of the plan. He was no puppet. He was a willing accomplice. Over 2 weeks, witness after witness was called. The toxicologist explained in technical detail how Chloe's previous husbands were likely poisoned. Relatives of those men testified about sudden changes in behavior after the marriages, about Chloe isolating her husbands from family, about convenient deaths that resulted in substantial inheritances. Robert presented financial documentation that left no doubt about the systematic embezzlement. Marcus described his investigation, the photos of the secret apartment, the meetings with Julian. Each piece of evidence was another brick in the wall closing in on Daniel and Chloe, eliminating any possibility of innocence. Julian, the corrupt lawyer, had made a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for testifying against Chloe and Daniel, he would receive a reduced sentence. His testimony was devastating. He described in detail how Chloe had specifically sought him out for help in obtaining fraudulent guardianship of a rich, senile mother-in-law. He said Chloe had asked for recommendations for doctors willing to provide false reports and witnesses who could be bought. That the plan was to declare me incompetent, gain full control of the finances, and then, in his words, wait for nature to take its course, with or without help. That last part caused an uproar in the courtroom. The judge had to call for order because Julian had essentially confirmed that Chloe was planning my death, whether by waiting for it to happen naturally or by speeding up the process. When it was my turn to testify again, this time in the full trial, I walked to the stand with a steady gait. My foot had fully healed, though I still felt a twinge on rainy days, but I no longer needed crutches, no longer showed physical fragility. I wanted the jury to see me as I was, a 68-year-old woman, perfectly capable, lucid, and strong. The prosecutor guided me through the full story again. This time, I could speak more freely, adding emotional details that had been left out of the preliminary hearing. I spoke about what it was like to first hear my son and daughter-in-law discussing my death, how it broke something inside me that would never be fully repaired. I talked about the fear of eating food Chloe prepared, about sleeping with my door locked in my own home, about living in a constant state of alert, about how every smile from them, every word of affection was like a stab because I knew it was fake. And I talked about the stairs, about the second before the push, when our eyes met and I saw in Chloe's pupils not sudden anger, but cold, calculated intent. About the physical pain of the bone breaking, yes, but mainly about the emotional pain of understanding that my own son, my blood, had approved of that violence against me. When I finished, there were jurors crying discreetly. Some avoided looking at Daniel and Chloe as if their very presence was contaminating. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense lawyers tried to destabilize me, suggesting I was a controlling mother who couldn't accept losing power over her adult son, that I was using my financial resources as a weapon of manipulation, that I had misinterpreted innocent conversations through the filter of a paranoid, lonely widow. I answered every attack calmly. I presented facts, not emotions, bank numbers, not hurt feelings, clear recordings, not subjective interpretations. It was impossible to discredit such solid evidence, but they tried. At one point, Chloe's lawyer made a mistake. He asked if I didn't think I was being dramatic, that a simple fall on the stairs didn't justify destroying the lives of 2 young people with prison. I looked at him and replied, "A simple fall?" My foot was fractured in 2 places. I needed surgery with metal pins. I was incapacitated for weeks. And you heard the video, the assault wasn't the fall, it was the deliberate push that caused the fall. And my son's words saying, "I deserved it." None of that is simple. None of that is accidental. It was premeditated violence against a 68-year-old woman by people who were supposed to protect me. The jury looked at me with expressions that mixed pity and anger. Pity for me, anger for Daniel and Chloe. It was exactly the reaction the truth deserved to provoke. The trial lasted for 3 weeks. More witnesses, more evidence, more arguments. The defense brought in psychologists trying to explain how good people could do bad things under financial pressure. The prosecution brought in experts on crimes against the elderly, showing patterns of behavior that Daniel and Chloe had followed almost like a manual. Finally, the day of closing arguments arrived. The prosecutor gave a powerful speech about how society fails to protect its elders, about how family trust is often used as a weapon, about how justice needed to be done not just for me, but to send a clear message that this type of crime would not be tolerated. The defense lawyers made their final efforts, asking for clemency, talking about youth and second chances, about how a long prison sentence would be disproportionate to the crime. But their voices sounded weak against the weight of the evidence. The jury retired to deliberate on a Friday afternoon. They said it could take days. I went home, emotionally exhausted, and waited. Claire had returned and stayed with me, keeping me company, distracting me with conversations about anything but the trial. The verdict came on Monday morning. The court called, saying the jury had reached a decision. My heart raced. 3 days was a relatively short time, which usually indicated the decision had been clear, not contentious. I returned to the courthouse with Claire by my side. The room was tense, silent. Chloe stared straight ahead, her face an empty mask. Daniel nervously bit his lip, his hands trembling even in cuffs. The judge entered and asked everyone to rise. The jury forewoman, a woman in her 50s with a serious expression, stood with the verdict slip in her hands. On the charge of aggravated battery, we find the defendant, Chloe Vance, guilty. I felt Claire squeeze my hand. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendants, Chloe Vance and Daniel Vance, guilty. On the charge of criminal conspiracy, we find the defendants, Chloe Vance and Daniel Vance, guilty. Guilty on all counts. The jury had had no doubts. Chloe remained motionless, but I saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek. Not of remorse, I realized, of rage at being caught. Daniel lowered his head and began to sob quietly. The judge then moved to sentencing. For Chloe, 12 years in prison, with no possibility of parole before serving half the sentence. For Daniel, 8 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 1/3, given his partial cooperation and lack of a prior criminal record. 12 years, 8 years. They were heavy sentences, but fair. Chloe would be nearly 40 when she got out. If she got out. Daniel would be 36. Their lives, at least as they knew them, were over. Part of me felt a pang of pain seeing my son led away again by the officers, that maternal impulse that never completely dies, regardless of what the child does. But most of me felt relief. Justice had been served. The nightmare was over. Outside the courthouse, I gave another brief interview. I thanked the justice system for listening to me, for taking the case seriously, for understanding that crimes against the elderly are as serious as any other. I said I hope my story would encourage others in the same situation not to be afraid to report, even when the abusers are family. Today, a year and a half after that Christmas that changed everything, I am sitting on my balcony having breakfast. The sun is warm, and I can hear the city starting its day. The bakeries are thriving under my renewed management. I've hired a trustworthy manager for the day-to-day, but I'm actively involved in the important decisions. I found that being forced to take back full control of the businesses gave me an energy I hadn't had in years. The house is different, lighter. I redecorated almost everything, bringing in brighter colors, new furniture, and plants that I let Claire tend to when I travel. Yes, I started traveling again. I went to the Caribbean earlier this year, something Richard and I had always planned but never did. It was bittersweet to do it alone, but also liberating. I've made new friends through a support group for people who have suffered financial and emotional abuse from family members. It's surprising and sad how many similar stories exist. Children who see their parents as living bank accounts, in-laws who plot inheritances before death, grandchildren who manipulate vulnerable grandparents. I've become a sort of mentor in the group, helping others recognize the signs and protect themselves legally and financially. The will I made remains valid. Leo, my nephew, will be the main beneficiary when I'm gone, along with the Foundation for Disadvantaged Children. Daniel will still receive the symbolic $50,000. Not out of generosity, but to make it legally clear that he wasn't forgotten, just consciously excluded from the bulk of the inheritance. I haven't visited Daniel in prison. He has written me 3 times, long letters begging for forgiveness, explaining how he got lost, how Chloe manipulated him, but that he was still responsible for his own choices. I didn't answer the first 2. The third one I received last week, and it's still on the living room table, unopened. Part of me wants to read it, wants to know what he has to say after a year of reflecting on his actions. Another part of me sees no point. Words won't change what happened. They won't bring back the lost time, the broken trust, the pain I carry. Maybe one day I'll open the letter. Maybe one day when he gets out of prison, we can have some sort of distant civil relationship. Not as mother and son. That died the moment he laughed at my fall. But maybe as 2 people who share a history and are trying to move on. But not today. Today is still too raw, too painful. Today, I prefer to focus on what I've built, the friendships I've cultivated, the life I've reclaimed. Chloe, according to Arthur, who keeps in touch with the DA's office, is having a hard time in prison. Apparently, her ability to manipulate people doesn't work so well when everyone around you is a criminal who recognizes another criminal. I feel a small, perhaps petty, satisfaction in that. The investigations into her previous husbands are ongoing. There's a real chance that formal murder charges will be filed. If that happens, she will never get out of prison. She will be where she belongs, away from vulnerable people she could exploit. Sometimes, late at night, I still have nightmares. I dream I'm falling down the stairs again, that I wake up and they are still in the house, that I find out too late that I've been poisoned. I wake up sweating, heart racing, and it takes me a few minutes to remember that I'm safe, that they are in prison, that the danger has passed. The therapist I started seeing a few months ago says it's normal. That trauma takes time to process, that the nightmares will eventually fade. I'm starting to believe her. The nightmares are already less frequent than they were at the beginning. What did I learn from all this? That trust is precious and must be given carefully, even to family, especially to family. Maybe because that's where we have the most to lose when we are betrayed. That being older doesn't mean being weak or incapable, and we shouldn't let anyone make us feel that way. I learned that it's possible to rebuild your life after destruction, that it's possible to find strength even when all seems lost, that justice, though delayed, still exists, and that surviving isn't just about continuing to exist, it's choosing to live fully despite what they tried to do to you. I look at the scars on my foot, still visible where the pins were inserted. Some people might see those scars as a reminder of victimization. I see them as a reminder of survival, of a fight, of victory. Eleanor Vance is no longer the naive widow who trusted blindly. She's no longer the mother who put her son above all else, even her own safety. She is a woman who looked betrayal in the face, fought back, and won. And if my story can help just one person to recognize the signs of abuse, to have the courage to report it, to protect themselves before it's too late, then all the suffering will have been worth it. Because in the end, it's not about the money they tried to steal. It's not about the inheritance they plotted for. It's about dignity, about the right to live without fear in your own home, about justice when family turns into predators, and about proving that 68-year-old widows with broken feet can be more dangerous and resilient than criminals in their 30s can ever imagine. I finish my coffee, I get up, and I start my day. I have a meeting at the bakery, lunch with Claire, a painting class in the afternoon, a normal life, a good life, my life. And that's exactly as it should be. The nightmare is over. Life goes on. And I, Eleanor Vance, am more alive than ever. Now, if you like this story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which part left your jaw on the floor. Oh, and don't forget to become a member to get access to exclusive videos I don't post here. I'll be waiting for you there.